So good afternoon and welcome to Nesta Talks event. Today we will be talking with Jeremy Heimans about the rules of power, old and new, and how these power dynamics are playing out in an age of crisis, and what this might mean for us as individuals, communities, organisations, public service governments, and indeed democracies. So my name is Carrie Deacon. I'll be your host for today, and I'm excited to help guide us through what will be a fascinating and timely conversation. For those of you who are new to Nesta, Nesta is a global innovation foundation that brings bold ideas to life to change the world for good. We hope that this conversation will guide us towards some answers, but of course, I expect it will raise even more questions. So this conversation forms part of our People Powered Shift Week, which is a series of digital events throughout this week, honing in on some of the work Nesta has been doing over the last decade, which has been seeking to make the case for a radical reimagining of the relationship between citizen and state. This is a relationship that we think needs to shift in order to redistribute power, with public services enabling communities and citizens to better address the complex challenges we face, supporting healthier, happier lives. Through a series of programs, some of which we'll be talking about throughout this week, we've researched and grant financed and supported people power innovations, which put compassion, connection, and collective power at their heart. And at the core of this has been the concept of power, and what we have featured some of the learning from that power and the dynamics of how we can enable better conceptions of power. And so it's really timely that we've got Jeremy Heimans joining us to talk about power and what that might mean from his perspective. So before I have the pleasure of introducing Jeremy, I wanted to briefly explain the format of today's conversation. Jeremy will start off with a brief outline of some of the key framing concepts of new power and how it's reshaping society, and outlining how understanding this could help us all understand how we can harness new and old power for good. So I'd encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat, as I've mentioned, and remember to put your questions in the Q&A button next to it. It's easier for us to go through if you get to the Q&A, put it in there. Otherwise, some of your questions and comments could get lost in the chat, but do keep chatting with each other in there. Do share on social media. We'd love your perspectives to resonate and reach out to more people. People power is created by us all, so do reach out through those channels. And do join us for further events on Thursday and Wednesday and Thursday, where we'll be discussing some of our work on upstream collaborative and how local government are adopting people power and new operating models. And on Thursday, we're going to be discussing democracy. As we flagged up, there'll be a recordings made available online next week. So without further ado, I'd like to, before I go into it then, so Jeremy's gonna talk us through his slides, as I said, then we'll really pull together the questions. So do start putting them in from the beginning, and then I'd love to pick on them as we go through, and I'll make sure we get to share some of the responses to those as quickly as possible. So put them in from the start, don't wait for the 20 minutes down the line when we're gonna go into the questions. So with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce Jeremy Heimans. Thank you for joining us today, Jeremy, from New York. Many of you will know some of Jeremy's work, but Jeremy has been building social movements since the age of 8, which is astounding, as a child activist on campaigns like issues such as children's rights and nuclear non-proliferation. He's the co-founder of Purpose, an organisation that works globally to build and support movements for an open, just and habitable world. And he's also founded things like Get Up and Avaz, massive social movements. Many of you will be familiar with the book New Power, which we'll be talking about today, which Jeremy co-authored with Henry Timms, released in 2018, which offers a fantastic account of how power is playing out in a hyper-connected age, which we think is super relevant to our discussions now, and obviously is even more timely given some of the things that are going on in the world right now. So I hope New York is treating you well this morning, Jeremy. And could you start us off with sharing some of the key ideas behind your account of New Power before we dig into it and what that might mean now?
Well, thank you, Carrie. It's great to be with you, and great to do something across the Atlantic. You know, everybody everybody's having a very strange 2020, but no less those of us in the United States. So I'm going to talk you through this concept of new power. Some of you may have already been exposed to it, but just to kind of ground you in some language and a lens that we can then use for our conversation. And this is really about sort of a method and a mindset to think differently about how organizations, leaders, and everyday people kind of exercise power in a world that, as Kerry said, is so connected that we all have the means of participation in our hands. So we're going to try to navigate here, see if that works. So let's just start with a few stories that kind of contextualize where we are, right? So the first story is the story of Harvey Weinstein. So I hate to bring Harvey up, but think about him as an archetype of a very particular kind of power player, right? He was so powerful, right, that he really ruled Hollywood like a god. He sat atop this hierarchy. He really used power like a currency, right? He hoarded that power up. The more of it he had, the more powerful he was. And he used it very strategically and very systematically to punish his enemies, create fear, to reward his friends and his protectors. So much so that at the beginning of our book, we cite a survey taken of the people over the last 30 years who have been most thanked at the Academy Awards in their Oscars acceptance speeches, and tied for first place with Harvey Weinstein was God. So you get a sense of this kind of power. We're all very familiar with that type of leadership style and that kind of power. But think about the Me Too movement and what it represents and the way power worked in that movement. Right? The Me Too movement was not one person sitting atop a hierarchy, directing that movement, shaping it. It was, in fact, a movement that really originated in a very decentralized way. So it came from a woman photographed here called Tarana Burke, who'd been using this idea for about 10 years. Then in November of 2017, it just sort of took off, right? And it spread like wildfire. And as it did, it evolved, it changed. New leaders emerged. In each country, it took a different shape. Rather than thinking about power, in this case, as currency, the Me Too movement represents power that works like a current, right? Like a surge of energy. It got more powerful the more people participated. And the unlocking collective action dynamic of the Me Too movement was that one person's testimony made it easier for the next person to come forward. So the second story is something that we're all, I think, about to live through in a very real way in 2021. And we're already living through the beginnings of this. So think about the anti-vaxxer movement, right? And how different that is. So I live in New York City, which you may know, last year had, for the first time in decades, a measles epidemic. And the measles epidemic, of course, arose from the power of these highly networked communities of anti-vaxxers. There's no big institution sitting behind them, right? There's no sort of bully pulpit that they get. But by organizing in these very powerful networks, by spreading their ideas in ways that create both a sense of fear, but also a sense of belonging among the people who are part of this, they've succeeded in massively undermining public health responses to major issues. And now, of course, we step into 2021, where the world's attention will be dominated by the need to vaccinate 7 billion people. And in many countries, including the UK, including the US, large minorities, approaching majorities in some contexts of the population, are expressing concern or hesitancy about taking a COVID vaccine. Third story. This is the story of a young schoolgirl from Glasgow called Aksa Mahmoud. So Aksa was a normal kid. She had a pretty sort of standard childhood. She grew up in Glasgow, as I said. She loved Harry Potter. She went to a great school. And then one day she disappeared. And her distraught parents heard from her a few days later, where she was calling them from Syria and she'd joined the Islamic State. So Aksa had been radicalized in her bedroom, and once she got to Syria, she became one of the most effective recruiters for the Islamic State. She built this network, this girl-to-girl network of other kind of lost girls, primarily from the West, and she helped to bring many more over to join her in Syria. And when we studied her techniques were a lot like, you know, she could have been a Justin Bieber fan, right? She had a blog with all of these approachable memes and emojis, sort of inviting people to make jihad, lists of things to bring when you come, bring organic coconut oil, because, you know, it's a great all-purpose product. It was so intimate and approachable. And she turned an ideology hell-bent on oppressing women, and she adapted that medieval ideology somehow to the audience that she was seeking to engage, right? And that was one of the strengths of ISIS's propaganda engine, was that it was very adaptable and extensible, even though the practice of it was extremely inflexible. And you contrast that to the US government and its response to ISIS when it first emerged. So the first thing the US government does when it realizes that ISIS is not just a kind of threat, a physical threat, it's a threat of ideas, right? Is they do something that they've been doing since the First World War. They use a technique which is basically they get some bombers and they start raining down leaflets on the civilian populations of Iraq and Syria, discouraging them from joining ISIS. So you think about the contrast between Aksa and her rapidly spreading ideology online, adapting itself, and then you think about the US government literally just raining its ideas down on people's heads. They then think, well, we better get onto this social media thing because that's where ISIS is. So they create this extraordinarily ill-judged Twitter account. Think again, turn away. This is in English, addressed to potential jihadists. And if you are just on the verge of joining ISIS, the US State Department is probably not the most persuasive messenger for you. So what do these three stories tell us? The story of a schoolgirl who effectively outmaneuvers the propaganda engine of the most powerful country in the world. The story of these anti-vaxxers who've chipped away at the expertise and faith and authority of public health institutions. And the story of a movement, Me Too, which ultimately helps to sweep away this titan, Harvey Weinstein, with a very different kind of power. So these are all examples of what we call the difference between old power and new power. And again, think of these as method and mindset, right? If you are a practitioner of old power, right? And most of us have grown up in an old power world. It's intuitive to us. You understand that power is currency. You know how to hoard it up. You know how to practice power that's based on what you have, what you know, what you own, what you control that others do not. You thrive, this kind of power thrives in closed ecosystems. It's based on what is downloaded, right? Now, if you have a mastery of new power, you understand not how to hoard power, but how to channel and harness the energy of these connected crowds, of communities, right? Different skill set. You can't really control it in the same way, right? And we'll talk about this more as this conversation unfolds. It's based on upload. It's peer-driven. It thrives in ecosystems that are open, not proprietary, not closed. Another way to think about the difference between old power and new power. This, of course, Tetris, the #1 video game of the 20th century. Now, think about Tetris as a metaphor for old power, right? It's a block-based game. There are these blocks. They're falling down on your head very fast. Your job is to sort them out into neat rows. The blocks get faster and faster and faster until they eventually overwhelm you. You have very little agency in this game. It's you versus the system. It's single player, and your job is to conform, and you eventually lose. Now, contrast this to the most popular video game of the 21st century, which is Minecraft. So what's interesting about Minecraft is, like Tetris, it's a block-based game. But then in all other respects, it really has a completely different kind of intellectual foundation, right? Everything in Minecraft is built from the bottom up. There are no rules. The way that you create a world, real or imagined, in Minecraft is in collaboration with other users, right? And all of these things and this enormous creativity has been birthed in this other world, as those of you who have young kids certainly will know. So, so think about being a kid today, right? Growing up, playing Minecraft all day the way that we may have played Tetris all day. And think about what's different about the expectations that are being shaped around your agency in the world. Do you get to participate rather than just be a cog in the wheel or passive, right? What's your relationship to institutions, right? And if you're playing Minecraft, you're going to develop a different set of values. So that is kind of what we describe as this difference between old power values and new power values. Now, before I kind of unpack this, I think it's really important to land one point, which is that our work is not new power good, old power bad, right? That if you look at this chart, there are many contexts in which, right, we're living through it now. Expertise, specialization, professionalism, we've needed that this year, right? We've needed that with this pandemic. We would have been nowhere without some really strong public health expertise helping to guide our behavior. That hasn't been enough, that said, right? Because you could have, all of the public health guidance in the world would not have been able to transmit to people unless people had taken on the job peer-to-peer of kind of creating these new norms, things we'd never heard of, right? I'd never heard of the concept of social distancing before this year, right? The beginning of this year, if I'd been walking around New York City with a mask, I would have looked incredibly rude or dangerous, right? So there was this need to create social norms, and a lot of that norm creation happened because people were very effective at very quickly transmitting those ideas, peer-to-peer, adapting to the communities that they're in. So a couple of these, just to draw these out: governance. New power values favor more informal, more networked forms of governance, right? New power is more flash mob than general assembly. It's not always a good thing. There are moments and contexts where representative governance becomes more inclusive, right? The loudest voices do not necessarily win. But it's important to understand that tension that you see in everywhere from workplaces to in our politics around issues like that. Transparency, we hear this buzzword all the time. Every organization's like, we're going to be very transparent. We're committed to transparency. Most of them, not at all, right? But you think about how important a dynamic it is in the world today. Cast your mind back to 4 years ago when Hillary Clinton had all of those emails leaked, right? She made a comment in a speech that was leaked where she said, look, politics is a messy business. And sometimes you need a public position, which is a little different to your private position, in order to get things done, right? Now that is a very legitimate articulation of that old power value around, separation between public and private, discretion, confidentiality. That's a way to do things. It's a way to make deals. It's a way to build trust. And yet think about what happened to Hillary, right? Those emails blew up. They were leaked. The speeches were leaked. And ultimately that contributed to the outcome that we're all living through today. And loyalty, affiliation. Many of you are working in sort of social sector organizations, public sector organizations that rely on people's participation, people's membership. Affiliation with charities, for example, is a lot less enduring. You can't count on someone being a donor for 20, 30, 40 years. So you have to find new ways of engaging people's desire to affiliate. People are affiliating more, right? But that affiliation tends to be more ephemeral. So where all of this led in our work was a framework, which we first published this idea in Harvard Business Review. If you've ever read HBR, you'll know that every HBR article needs to have one of these, right? A little 2x2 matrix. So ours was really mapping these two axes. On the horizontal axis, values. Do the values of an organization map more to the left-hand side or the right? And on the vertical side, the model, right? Does the model look more like a Tetris, like reliant on capture, control, exclusivity, proprietary, etc., or a new power model? Does it rely more on what is uploaded, on mass participation of various kinds? So let's take a little tour on this compass. So on the bottom left are the castles. So these are the organizations that sort of thrived in the 20th century. Many of them are struggling. Some of them are still strong. Apple might be an example that sort of draws out a bit of a nuance, right? So Apple is, in our view, an old power company technology is not new power, right? People can use technology in very old power ways. If you think about the Apple business model, it's really based on the idea that there are these genius product designers in California who know what we need before we know we need it. And the sort of new iPhone descends from the heaven and we buy it. Think about where those Apple stores all around the world, you'll notice that the Apple logo tends to be where the crucifix would be in a church, right? Because the relationship we have with Apple is one of worship, of admiration, not of participation, right? And it's a very secretive company. It's a very bad collaborator by reputation. And yet, it's the most valuable company in the world by many measures. So, the nuance there is that you can still have successful strategies in this quadrant, but most companies can't be Apple. In the bottom right, you've got models that are old power, but in evolution. You think about the Guardian newspaper, still basically an old power model. Journalists write stuff, we read it, download, right? But, as you know, in the last decade, they've experimented with a whole bunch of ways to open that up, right? They've created this concept of a member rather than a subscriber. And a member, has more of a stake in the newspaper. They participate, they're invited to get involved. They've tried to bring their readers into the research process in some cases, into activism on behalf of the values of the newspaper. So still early days, but it's sort of evolving, certainly in its values and certainly beginning to evolve in its model in a more new power direction. Top right, you've got the crowds quadrant. Now, we talk a lot in the book about Black Lives Matter, and when we wrote the book, of course, this year's events had not yet occurred. But what we talk about is the role of these new decentralized movements that are not institutions at all. So in that top right, you can't knock on the door of Black Lives Matter and say, let me speak to the head of it, right? Instead, there are many leaders, and the Black Lives Matter founders were very intentional about this when they helped to spark this movement. That creates a bunch of advantages and in some ways some disadvantages to the model. In this quadrant, you've also got models like Airbnb, which are much more institutionalized. Obviously, they're big companies, but they rely on many of these dynamics, right? That's a dynamic entirely reliant on peer coordination between people. And values-wise, they've tried to really invest in building a kind of community of people around that company, so much so that their hosts have essentially become lobbyists on their own behalf in their regulatory battles, right? You can't imagine Marriott Hotel Group getting its consumers to be lobbyists for it, right? But the Airbnb model has enabled this interesting dynamic between the community and the platform. And then we have the top left. Now, the top left is probably the most dangerous quadrant in the world today. These are the co-opters, right? These are the models that are very good at new power. They can massively engage us. They can get us participating. Facebook has more than 2 billion of us uploading, creating, sharing every day. And yet, I don't need to labor this point anymore. When we first made this point in 2014, it was kind of like, oh, that's a bit harsh. Massively extractive. We have no agency on the platform. We're being manipulated in many ways. So they use network effects to get to scale. Once they get to scale, they lock in these very old power values. And our power relationship with Facebook is obviously a very problematic one. So the exercise that we generally ask people to do, which you should do if you're interested, back home, is, and with your own organizations and teams, is plot your organization on this compass, right? And figure out where you think you are now and where you want to be in 5 years' time. And then fun bonus, and you'll have to read this in the book because we don't have time to go through it. We have an interesting overlay in the book that applies this framework to individual leadership styles and models. And so if you want to find out whether you're more like Kim Jong-un or the Black Lives Matter founders as a leader, you can even take a quiz. It's on our website, which is thisisnewpower.com. The results may scare you. Some implications, just to draw them out quickly before we jump into the discussion, which is always more fun. So really, if I was to give you one takeaway, right, is that wherever you are, the future is likely to be a battle over who can mobilize best. If you are fighting for the climate, know that battle is between the mobilization capacities of the fossil fuel industry, the mobilization capacities of the climate deniers, and scientists and everyday people who are trying to spread their ideas. It isn't enough to be right. It isn't enough to have the facts on your side. If the last 5 years have shown us anything, it should be that, right? But what that means is we have an obligation to master these new power tools, to spread our ideas and to mobilize communities around those ideas. You know, if we're standing up for values of humanity and pluralism and reason and science. The most effective models actually blend old and new power, right? So the answer in our work and in our book is often not, you know, new power, that's it, that's going to solve your problems. It's really about models that, in a sophisticated way, blend them, right? So the company that I run is called Purpose. It's a company that works all over the world on 6 continents on movement building and on working with kind of established old power philanthropies and nonprofits and sometimes companies on their work in this area on progressive issues. The NRA, unfortunately, is a master of the blend of old and new power, right? So what we did at Purpose was worked with Michael Bloomberg to create Everytown, which is a sort of attempt in the US to create a kind of massive counterweight to the NRA, which has begun to chip away at their power through both an old power model, institution, expertise, authority, a little bit of fear among lawmakers of crossing the way that people are afraid of the NRA, but also a mass movement that has the ability to do things far beyond the kind of constructs of any one organization. We're doing that right now on COVID. So we've formed this very interesting partnership at Purpose, quite unexpected really, with the UN, where we are creating, in order to fight COVID misinformation, we're taking the old power expertise of the UN agencies, the WHO, all their health experts, etc. We're taking that content, which is very dry, which is often not able to spread, right, in the way that misinformation is very typically optimized to spread. We're repackaging it, we're verifying that information, and then we're turning it into information that's optimized for compelling sharing, particularly to vulnerable populations. And then we're asking everyday people to become the digital first responders who share that peer-to-peer, because dropping that from on high isn't going to get us there. And just to leave you with one thought, you know, I think all of us, especially in this moment, this incredibly fraught moment, I think the question to ask ourselves every day as we kind of get up the learning curve on new power and how to use it is, are we using it to help the least powerful? And how do we do that? And we've certainly faced that challenge coming into next year, right? Where we're trying to get the climate agenda back on track. We're trying to vaccinate 7 billion people. And the question will be, who gets to be vaccinated first? Who gets access? These are all going to be questions that new power is going to play a big role in shaping. And the question is, who's going to use these tools of participation more effectively? So I think I'm going to leave it at that so we can jump into a conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy, and so much covered in such a short amount of time. I'm going to ask everyone to hold off doing the quiz. Annette shared the quiz, but I know everyone will be fascinated by mapping where they are. Just to start off and to build on some of the discussions that you've brought up there, Jeremy, across the world, we're seeing different countries responding different ways. For example, I know that in Taiwan, we're seeing lots of the work celebrated on how Taiwan have been responding, often using different models of power and the power of peers to share and respond using things like your digital first responders. How are you looking across the globe about how we're responding to crises like COVID at the moment and the pandemic, and how you're seeing new and old power play out?
Yeah, we talk about Taiwan and the work particularly of Audrey Tang in the book. I think, you know, it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, a lot of the variables are also, are these societies open or closed? How much surveillance is happening? So you could argue that Taiwan is an incredibly inspiring story, or you could argue that a lot of it relies on a particular kind of surveillance of people and people's willingness to be surveilled. Now, that hasn't been used in nefarious ways there necessarily, but you see the dynamics at play. So clearly a big factor is going to be, you know, who controls the means of participation, and are those means being manipulated, right? So the relationship between the state and the platform becomes really important. We sort of warn in the book of the emergence of something we call the platform state. And the platform state is what we see in China, particularly, where the platforms are really in lockstep with the state in terms of pursuing objectives that may include really controlling people, right, in a large scale way. In the US, that's also kind of emerging a little bit, right? Facebook's relationship with the Trump administration, there's an alliance of interests there, right? If you look at where their content is coming from, et cetera, and there's evidence of that, right? Now, we're not at that stage here in the US yet, but you could imagine if Trump were to be reelected, that alliance might get even stronger, right? Because the threat of regulation, causes accommodations, and you see the erosion of those things. So I would look carefully at this relationship around the world between the state and the platform.
And Gethin actually has posed a question about that, mentioning the social dilemma, which I presume, Gethin, you mean the Netflix series, that film that's come out, where you think, has it made you rethink social media and big data companies and where they sit on the power values spectrum? I know you put Facebook somewhere in particular already, but have you been reflecting on that over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so actually Purpose, my company, has been running the key aspects of the campaign around the social dilemma. So we've been very involved in that. So yeah, we're seeing it up front. So the challenge is, we kind of know there's a problem, right? Or we're getting there, right? We're getting to the point where people are beginning to develop a large scale public consciousness that something is wrong. But the next step, I think, is turning that into real action. And that's what we're beginning to try to bridge. Like, there isn't really yet mass mobilization around this, right? And there should be, because it's as big a danger in some ways than the issues themselves that we fight on and that we advocate for. So I think the next step is a mass movement to really take on the power of these platforms. And that will probably dovetail with regulatory efforts. But I think actually having a movement is going to be really important, because the regulatory efforts may end up not also having our interests fully at heart, right? Because governments don't tend to want to expand speech and expand the agency of people in ways that, you could end up with a world where you have highly regulated platforms, and at the same time, like the kind of domain of speech is sort of shrunk, right, in ways that are unhelpful. So I think there's a way to regulate these platforms that is kind of in the spirit of the consumer movement, right? It's about maximizing choice. It's about competition. It's about the ability to take your data and seamlessly move it from platform to platform, the way you can move your mobile phone number if you want to change carriers, for example.
Yeah, and we've done some work on some of this around our data commons work at Nesta, as well as some of our work around Future News Fund, where we're really trying to think about where are the places that you can get information and those kinds of things. A question from another audience member talks about his interest in artificial intelligence and questions whether is power really distributed in the new model, or is it being subtly controlled by the algorithms designed by the big players? And are there therefore lessons that we need to grapple with to seize back this control that you allude to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big theme of our book. And I think if you read the last chapter, we both describe the dynamic that your questioner raises and also posit some solutions, right, potentially. So yeah, the paradox of our moment is power is both more decentralized than ever and more concentrated than ever, right? So the platforms have far more power than the media barons of the 20th century had, right? Because there's just much more scale, network effects. It's deeply concentrated, right? So that's a very complex dynamic. There is this sort of dance of decentralization and concentration of power that is a major, major problem. And it's not a simple thing of like, power has been democratized, woohoo. I think we're all past the point of thinking that that's what's happened.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that. Another question then, where have you seen new power used to help those without power most effectively, Jeremy?
I mean, look, I think you see it all the time. I think you see it in the fight for vulnerable people and populations. obviously this year, the dynamics around Black Lives Matter have been fascinating, right? What are some of the distinctive things? People with more power have, in the US at least, particularly among young people, white allies have really stepped up in a way that they didn't in the previous phase of the movement. And that, I think, is an example of that. Doing some of the work of educating each other about these things rather than putting that labor onto people of color. So I think that has been a really interesting dynamic to watch. And there are some ways in which that is done and understood that are quite different to previous generations of activists. So as you mentioned, I've been an activist for all my life, basically, and seeing and learning from some of these new activists who have a different mindset, even to the one that I grew up with, different language, different lens, has been fascinating.
You mentioned how you kind of develop the skill sets for these kind of things. So learning from these new activists, but developing, if you've been born and grown up in this old power world, but new power is taking hold, how do we develop skill sets that enable us to navigate old and new power more effectively? I'm particularly thinking this week, we've been talking a lot about the role of public servants, the role of civil society organizations in helping more in this kind of people-powered shift. And I'm really interested in your take on how we can develop that craft.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a lot of what our work is about, is sort of helping to get people started on that journey. I think the key is not to think of this as something that you can kind of outsource, right? So it isn't about hiring what we call your digital beard, who makes you look innovative, and you keep them hidden away in a closet and bring them out every now and then to like cut ribbons at your 3D printing ceremony. You need to give people themselves need to be inhabiting these mindsets and these methods. So, there's a lot of different ways to think about that. I think one of the things that people often misunderstand is they think that new power happens by outsiders disrupting, right? Particularly within organizations. And one of the things that we argue is that actually disruption is a lot less effective than having people with old power credentials kind of learn these new skills and embody them, right? So we have this concept, this contrast we draw in the book between the disruptor, the 24-year-old that is really good at TikTok that you hire that you think is going to change everything, doesn't work, right? Or the shapeshifter. And the shapeshifter is the person with deep credibility within an institution. Everybody knows they understand its DNA and its values, they're respected, and yet they're the ones who can very effectively show and lead new power by modeling it, right? So, you can make many critiques of him, but Pope Francis is a good example of this shapeshifter archetype, right? He has, obviously infallible credibility, right? You can't deny that. And yet he did, and we talk about this in the book, model a different power relationship between the church, those very powerful cardinals, and the lay parishioners in a whole bunch of ways that only someone like with that kind of background could have done. So as you're thinking about change, it's not necessarily let's get good at TikTok and hire the kid who can do it. It's actually who's the shapeshifter and who is what we call the new power bridge. And the new power bridge is the person that can really speak both languages, right? And I think that's part of why Henry and I wrote this book. We're both too young to be the TikTok kids, too old, sorry, to be the TikTok kids, and too young to be, we had some of that new power lens and vocabulary, and we were somewhat native to it. So we could bridge between the two worlds, right? And that becomes really important, right? And learning those things allows you to create those models that bring together the best of old and new power.
And I know that you've, building on that, you've worked with some kind of public services. This week we're talking about the people-powered shift in public services. So I know you've done some work with, for example, our NHS. But how do you get innovators within kind of these systems that are so important? And as we talked about the dilemma between expertise and kind of this new power model, how do we help public servants really embrace and learn this kind of art going forward?
I lost you for a bit there, Kerry, but I think I understood your question. I think that might be my connection, not yours. But yes, NHS is a fascinating example. So they have really, lots of pockets of the NHS have taken up new power in amazing ways, right? They've taken the principles and used them to, for example, there was a challenge that emerged to help older people avoid hospital stays in which they were stuck in bed, because the longer a person above a certain age stays in bed without moving and getting up, essentially the prognosis becomes very, very bad, right, in terms of degeneration. So a bunch of people applied the New Power principles and created this PJ challenge, which is getting people out of their PJs, getting them around, walking. It was a fascinating New Power campaign. Every hospital adapted it in different ways. There was amazing content created around this hashtag. The hashtag was Stop PJ Paralysis. It actually drove far better outcomes than sort of centralized mandates around, sedentary practices in hospitals. So, I think New Power can be a great way in the public services to empower frontline actors. If we've seen anything this year, it's that frontline workers and frontline people can be the most important agents of change we have, and that we need them. And we need to give them power and agency to do that. And I think that was a great example. So, and I think it can be a powerful means to talk about activating patients, right? Activating to broaden your question, the users of public services and give them agency. Now, this isn't simple, right? You have to structure intelligently for participation. And that's a lot of the work that we do. And certainly happy to chat with folks afterwards. We have a team of about 45 people now in the UK working on these kinds of issues at Purpose. So happy to engage in conversations about building these kinds of models in the UK, because we're fascinated by that work.
Brilliant. And that certainly does reflect some of our work as well with public services, and some of our work of, say, for example, our people powered results team, who experiment with frontline professionals and communities and people who use the services together to create some of the big shifts and the changes by using those participatory methods. So it's definitely, someone's asked for some tips for convincing people within organizations who are culturally old power to see the value of new power and its potential of blending the two to bring around new possibilities. So what are your top tips for people, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I don't think the answer is kind of tell them that they're dinosaurs, right? So you've got to kind of lower their defenses, right? Which is part of why I think the message, the key tip is, don't come in and say you're obsolete. Come in and say your old power skills and our organization's old power skills, our connections, our credibility, our expertise, whatever it is, that's essential, right? What we're trying to do is build on top of that, not build in place of that. And that tends to create a lot more openness to this work than if it feels like you're coming to undermine people's professional identities or undermine people's sense of place, right? So that's important. And then I think this compass exercise is a really good starting point, like getting that conversation going around, okay, where do we want to be? Not everybody should be in the top right of that quadrant, right? But beginning to have that conversation becomes really important.
And do you know organizations that have learned to navigate the different quadrants within different bits, or do you tend to settle in one?
No, I mean, I think you see different parts of large organizations inhabiting different parts of that quadrant. I mean, the joke, of course, is like the compliance department is never going to be, in the top right? Although, interestingly, we were at a major philanthropy in the US, and the chief compliance officer got up in a fit of frustration and said, because everybody would say, well, we can't do this because of the regular. She said, stop using compliance as an excuse not to make real change. We can work around the compliance issues if you guys actually want to change. So sometimes people use those guys as as an excuse for inaction, rather than them being the real obstacle.
That sounds very familiar. We were having some discussions with some public services where we kept saying, what is the barrier? What is the thing that's stopping you? And they could never quite pinpoint. It was a vague kind of legislation or something that never...
Right, regulatory frameworks.
Exactly. Yeah. Very familiar. Abby mentions, she says, it seems that we need to be fighting concurrently the very traditional old power constructs like land, ownership, banking, oil, and those that co-opt new power like Facebook, Uber at the same time. And how do we retain agency and effectiveness when they seem to be so effective with the individual responsibility messages, or divide and rule kind of tactics?
It's a great question. It's a great question. It's a sophisticated question. I think the point about individual responsibility is interesting, right? So certainly that's a tactic of, say, the fossil fuel industry. Oh, you know, you've got to remember to turn your lights off, right? Where we all know that's not the main game. On Facebook, it's interesting because we're not really even given any individual responsibility. We don't really have the ability to change the algorithm. The algorithm is imposed on us. So I think that's one of the things that'd be interesting in the future, is like building models where we each can exercise some choice around what we filter in and out, which we don't really have now at all. You know, we have some privacy settings, but that's very different to actually being able to change the way we are being manipulated by these forces.
Great. And I guess building slightly on this with the open data, someone who's an open data activist thinks there's a great unrealized potential of open data to deliver social and economic benefits, but how do we build a community and movement around that, given the many roles, skills, interests that need to come together to deliver those benefits? I don't know whether that's something you know about, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think these types of communities depend on new power dynamics really working. So, you know, open data in and of itself doesn't actually, like, transparency in and of itself does not really change anything, right? It's what people do with it, and it's about the ability to collaborate around some of these things. And so I think look to open source communities, for example, that are really successful at not just creating transparency or openness or shared ownership, but also creating the kinds of cultures of collaboration that mean that you can do powerful things with an open architecture.
I can understand. So it's how we grapple with making transparency real to people and enabling that to work for people. Someone else is
the transparency is enough. It isn't. Yeah. It isn't in and of itself going to do much. It's actually a trick by the powerful in some cases. We'll make this transparent, but it's too opaque to do anything with. And that's where I think a lot of this sort of big data, open data movement, you know, sounds great, but it's not always particularly impactful.
Yeah, particularly if it's just published but not enable, as you said.
Yeah.
Someone else has put in a big exclamation mark, it's risk. Have you got any views of risk and how risk plays out through these dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sure I have anything interesting to say on that, other than that risk is a lot of why organizations resist the trying new power, right? Risk is often used as an excuse. There's often this idea that the choice between old and new power is a kind of binary between control and anarchy, which is really not the case. You can control what kind of participation you invite and what kind of participation you don't. And you can create parameters and structures around that participation. So when people say, well, this is too risky, or what happens if it gets out of control, or if the crowd takes it in a direction we don't want, that's often just like an excuse for inaction, because these things can be intelligently designed and a degree of risk, a different orientation toward risk can be developed by people who are sophisticated at using new power.
Brilliant. And I think there was just a further point on the risk where Sophia was saying, she was referring to why old power won't move to new power, the risk that people power really is better. So these kinds of entrenched, that letting go of power and giving it to people is just it's seen as too risky.
Yeah, it is. No, I think that's right. And I think philanthropy is a good example of that as well, right? It's like, there's a lot of resistance to really giving up power, right? It's like, we really like want to help you guys, but we really like, we know better, right? There's a lot of that and that's true of public services too, in some ways.
And how do you feel like you can, from your experience, make the conditions, therefore, that we can, I guess, play and adopt and feel safe trying out these different dilemmas of new and old power and using them in our organizations in a safe way? Because often that risk and that challenge is of letting go is because people feel like they're going to be giving it all away. So how have you seen that play out?
How have we seen the sort of journey of accepting different levels of risk?
I guess what I'm alluding to is, how do we create conditions where it feels safe for people to play with these new concepts of power and not feel like they're risking everything?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's we give a lot of examples in the book of how organizations have sort of gotten to that place of comfort. And they're from all sorts of interesting places, right? We talk about Lego, the company, which turned out to was having a real crisis in the early 2000s and then rediscovered its community and figured out that the heart of that community were not kids, but adults. So there was this kind of tribe called the adult fans of Lego, the AFOLs. And they were the people who had the interesting ideas for new products, and they were building these amazing models of famous buildings or of like these series, and they had the spending power. And so they began to organize the company around these AFOLs. They were terrified of doing that at first. And they assumed that these AFOLs were probably quite weird because, like, whoa, who are these adults still playing with Lego? And yet they ended up creating step by step a bunch of structures and systems to channel that energy that they found into innovation platforms where those adults could propose new models and ideas and have them voted on by a community. And the ones that were most popular got commercialized by Lego, and they shared some of that value with the creators. They created a whole ecosystem of digital platforms and new departments and new skills needed. Didn't happen overnight, but the key thing there was a fear of embracing these regular people. And step by step, I think, you know, not by, you don't open the spigot altogether on day one, right? That confidence was built and the company was transformed.
I love that example, that how you embrace the outside and put that inside alongside. That's definitely resonates. And if you're in a similar situation, you're a community activist, or you're in a small scale organization, hasn't got masses of resource, what would be your first step into this world?
If I were a community organizer,
yeah,
I think community organizers typically know this stuff better than big institutions, right? So I would start by really anchoring it into what the community itself is saying, right? So there's a big difference between consultation and participation. I think often the mistake that people make is they're like, my job is to listen. I'm going to do a listening tour. I'm going to hear from people, and then I'm going to decide. And the bigger challenge is is actually participation and the difference, and helping people to think about the structures that create that difference is really important.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I know you've got to shoot off, but one final thing, what's the final reflection that you want people to leave people with?
Look, I think you guys are all doing really important work at a time where, particularly those of you in the public sector and the social sector, it's just sort of needed more than ever. So I would say, remember that, you know, you're fighting for these values at a time when those values are at stake. And in order to do that, really beginning to learn these new power skills is a critical part of that. And I'm happy to be in contact with folks afterward and look for ways to collaborate, with them on their work, kind of engaging the public, creating participation, building movements and trying to make that transition from old to new power.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. A fascinating discussion, and we'll be sharing details, and do check out Jeremy's book, and we'll share details of how you may look him up too. So thank you for your time, for your questions, and for your participation. As I said, today is part of a wider series of events. We've got some more events tomorrow and on Thursday, so do check them out and register. We will be sharing the recording as well. And thank you so much for your ideas and participation. We hope you'll enjoy more of the work from the People Power Shift this week, and we look forward to engaging and hearing more from you. Thank you so much. Take care.